Hannah Janeway. I'm an emergency physician that I work in LA, both in the community and a little bit academically. I also run an organization in Tijuana called Refugee Health Alliance, which is a nonprofit that serves migrants and other vulnerable people at the U.S.-Mexico border.
Hi, everybody. Shamsher Samra, ER doc at Harbor. Do some work with Hannah. Great to be here with you all.
Can't hear you.
Shamsher Samra. Hey, everybody. Good morning. Is that a little bit better? Okay, perfect.
Okay, so we'll get started. I have no disclosures other than I run this nonprofit, but I don't make any money from the nonprofit. Actually, the opposite. Names and important details of the cases I'm going to present are completely changed to protect their anonymity, and there are some photos, but those photos are completely de-identified, and they're not the same photos of the people that I'm speaking of, and they're obviously given to me with the patient's consent. So these are our objectives. You can read through them, but basically one of our major objectives today is to talk a little bit about the structural and infrastructural forces that cause displacement and migration, because those are really the root cause of disease, and I think that's one of the things that's the most important to us as physicians. We're going to talk about legal categories, we're going to learn practical tools to use daily with patients and families, and we're going to strive the ways in which providers can work in solidarity with displaced individuals. So obviously this is a really important topic. A lot of people are like, well, this doesn't affect me, but it does. I'm sure every day you see someone who's been displaced in some way in your emergency department. 1 in 97 people in the world has been forcibly displaced, and that doesn't even include all the migrants and immigrants that you might see in your emergency department, because forcible displacement has its own specific definition. In 2020, 82.4 million people were forcibly displaced from their homes and their communities. And that means, I've been talking for about a minute or 2 minutes, so in the last 2 minutes, 50 people have been forced to flee their homes, and every day 37,000 people are forced out of where they live, which is an enormous amount and still is impressive to me every day despite the work that I do. Up till now, before I started doing this work, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, this was kind of how I thought about migrant health in general. This is from the CDC website, and actually really interestingly, below where I cut off this picture was another little square that was about international adoption. But this is kind of how a lot of people look at it, these really technical instructions for how to deal with refugees and migrants, which I don't find to be particularly helpful. And the other approach I was kind of told was oh, here are some research methods, how can we look at large populations and their movement and study them. But it didn't really help me on a practical standpoint as a physician to understand, A, what are these larger forces that are at play, and B, how do I interact with my patients on a day-to-day basis. So it kind of led me to this question of what is missing, and I'm going to kind of take you through a little bit of my own journey, because I think it's kind of the easiest way for me to explain how I've come to think about things and what I think is missing from the general discourse on this topic. So I always like to start with this picture of a border, because it's good to remember that borders are not natural divisions. They're really not. They're structures, and these are physical structures that are built on top of ideological lines that were drawn by and through political power. And most of these were drawn during colonial eras. So if you look at there's kids on this one side of the border, you can see that those kids have enacted upon them these hierarchies of citizenship. And those hierarchies follow them, even if they cross over to the other side of the border. And these sort of systems of citizenship give some people, like the people on the left-hand side of this sort of diagram, what amounts to feudal privilege over other people who then become classified as illegals or immigrants. And then these forms of privilege kind of predetermine the forms of health and illness of any one individual patient. And I like this photo because this is a really cool art project, but B, I also like it because it's really depressing when you think about health equity in general, and you realize the border is a huge impediment to health equity, because when you have some people on one side of the border who have so much less privilege and access to health, security, and wellness than the people on the left side, you see that a border actually has a lot to do with how people are able to access resources to make them well. And this can be seen in a lot of studies. These are just two that, I like to cite. The first looked at undocumented Latinos and compared them to people who have documentation, and they were found to receive less likely to report receiving blood pressure and cholesterol checks from their physicians, less likely to report having received excellent or good quality of care, and more likely to receive no health or healthcare-related information from their doctors, even after adjusting for, obviously, confounders. And then the bottom one was like a large sample of undocumented Mexicans and other undocumented Latinos who reported less use of healthcare services and poorer experiences compared with their US-born counterparts. So really, these privileges and these power dynamics follow people even if they are able to cross the border. So I want to kind of go through this sort of my process by talking about two different cases, and then we're going to kind of talk about how they're similar and how they're different, more how they're similar. The first case is Karina. She's the mother of a young child that I met named Lily when I treated Lily for a diarrheal illness in Tijuana. The family had fled El Salvador after some cartel members had come after their family and killed her brother and her father, and so they fled the country. And this is a story I told in an op-ed that I wrote, but it's very similar to very many stories that I've heard. So basically people fleeing unimaginable violence when they attempt, and then coming to the border and being denied access to the United States, and having to wait for their ability to obtain asylum in the world's basically most dangerous city. And the second story is of a young man who was about 18 who came to my clinic one afternoon with just like an infected bite. He was getting ready to cross the border, and he also came from El Salvador, but he came because his family was really struggling. There have been a lot of different new political and economic changes in the country, and his family just basically couldn't meet ends meet, and that became really apparent to him when his 13-year-old sister had gotten sick and then basically died because they couldn't access health care or didn't have the money to. And so he basically left El Salvador to come to the United States to have more economic opportunities to help out his family. So, two different families, and they all fled to the border for apparently different reasons. But I like to ask people, if it was up to you, who would you allow into the United States? Like, who deserves to be in the United States? And then a different question is, who would have a legitimate claim to asylum? So asylum law is complicated and really very explicit. So in order to obtain asylum, a person seeking asylum must be unable or unwilling to return to his or her country of origin because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of these 5 categories: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And if you do not fall into one of these 5 groups, then you will not be given asylum. And I just want to make a commentary because I think there's a lot of things people think, but like being someone who's been a victim of cartel violence, that does not count as membership in a particular social group. And being a woman or someone who has experienced gender-based violence, that a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times does not be considered as membership in a particular social group. So it is actually difficult to fit into one of these 5 categories. So when I first started this work, I took some classes and other things, and this is what I was told. Like, there's migrants, and then there's stateless people, and then there's refugees, and then there's asylum seekers. And really, it's important to know the differences between them, and you can read them over. But this is all just based on legal frameworks, based on, international human rights. But I actually really don't think that these are helpful, because they don't recognize that the forces that cause migration for all these different people are inherently related, and they don't recognize the root causes of disease, because migration is a disease. So the same processes that cause people to flee from violence also create gender discrimination, economic migrants, and other things. And what I found is really that these approaches shy away from or ignore the important histories and policies that have created migration in the first place. And so we're going to go over this a little bit using those 2 case studies.
Cool, thank you, Hannah. Yeah, and I think one of the ways that this kind of notion of dividing or distinguishing between different types of migrants is potentially dangerous is it kind of permeates into general kind of social conversations about who's worthy and who's not worthy, and it permeates into kind of our language and the way we act within medicine. A lot of the conversations around violence and displacement of folks focuses on gangs and like MS-13, and some folks know this. I mean, this chart is essentially showing kind of deportations of quote-unquote ex-convicts, and people will frame these folks as not worthy of asylum, and who are a less worthy type of migrant. And folks in this room may know kind of the short story of how MS-13 started as folks who were, deported from Los Angeles, and, that's how kind of the organization started. But there's a lot more complexity in there, and a lot, to Hannah's point, a lot of structural forces that actually, if we understand those, we understand the humanity of folks and not just, apply this label that makes them less worthy. Provides an understanding. It requires an understanding of the history of the countries of the folks that we're serving, right? So in El Salvador, for instance, we're not going to go through the whole history, but this history of extractive economies where you have concentration of wealth amongst a handful of folks, so you can extract exports and send them to the United States. I was just walking down the street here, and I noted United Fruit Company is just right down the way. It just kind of rings true about how this relates to us here locally, and how those extractive economies breed inequities in other countries and instability of governments and states. In El Salvador in particular, those inequities led to a civil war where, against a backdrop of the concerns about communism, the United States funded the Salvadorian military, leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of folks and displacing many more to the United States. And ultimately, what followed from that, after the revolution was suppressed, you have economic and neoliberal interventions which destabilize the state to further promote kind of free trade and, again, extraction, but doesn't allow the free movement of folks. So if we understand the histories and we understand the structures, we understand the instability and the precarity that folks face, and we can move away from worthy, not worthy, or start to move away from that. And that's the picture I took this morning. I don't know. And it's uncomfortable for medical folks, right? We think biomedically, we're scientific, but it's important for folks who are doing work in this space and for us to have conversation amongst our peers to move beyond the medical manifestations and addressing them and advocating for better medical care, and start to engage in conversations with the underlying structural forces, encourage folks to have a structural competence, a historical understanding, because really we're in a privileged position to talk about health and wellness, and rather than kind of focusing on like partisan politics or whatever else. And Hannah, feel free to chime in if I'm missing anything. But that brings us back to the cases of Karina and Lily and Manuel, and we can see if we start to think about these forces how their situations may be very similar in terms of what's bringing them here, and it brings into question our own kind of positionality and what makes us different. How would we have acted in a different way, and would we have been wanted to be considered like less or more worthy? And the difference really is that we happen, not all of us, I'll speak for myself, happen to be born into a privileged position where I can transgress or cross borders without any significant obstruction or obstacles. And it's important to kind of recognize that positionality and privilege when we enter into these conversations. And if we're talking about moving, if we recognize those structures and those histories and this violence that's occurring, what is the normative framework that we actually hope to see? And I think what we would argue is that it's a couple of things, very simply. It's one, that people have the right to stay and people have the right to move. And what we mean by that is that right to move is something that maybe comes more naturally, like there shouldn't be all these barriers when people are escaping some of these structural forces. But then the right to stay is that realizing the fact that folks don't want to leave where they're at. They don't want to leave kind of communities they have, families they have, heritages, cultures, et cetera. So we also have to engage with the forces that are driving people to move, right? Whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about imperialism, military interventions, all these things. These have to be part of the conversations that we're having when we talk about migration, immigrant health, et cetera. So what we're gonna name kind of these two very easy principles, right to stay, right to move, is this, we'll call it, essentially it requires an abolition of borders. To Hannah's point, these are kind of things that were created historically in colonial periods that initiated, reproduced exploitation. And we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of abolition, but folks familiar with conversations around prison abolition will know that this doesn't mean that we go to the border, we tear it down and eliminate all citizenship today, right? This is talking about imagining and creating a world where the borders aren't necessary, right? You create the conditions where people aren't displaced, where people don't feel compelled to have to move. And I think it's important just because there has been more conversations about kind of prison abolition and what that means to understand that prisons and borders are contiguous in terms of their function. Their infrastructure and their real purpose is we have to think about as controlling surplus populations. If we think about it domestically, we think about prisons and jails largely caging folks that are poor communities of color. And if we think about it on a global scale, in a globalized capitalist system, these are folks who are moving because they're not accommodated by the economic systems, right? And instead of creating systems of care to serve those folks or economic stability, what we do is we contain and we reproduce social suffering, whether it's domestically in jails and prisons or globally in prisons or via borders. And another significant purpose of this is to, rather than providing services, community-based mental health services, stable jobs, housing, we render these populations invisible, whether it's through borders, like we'll extract resources, we'll build all the things we need to build, but we don't want to have to deal with all the suffering and the inequity that comes with it, similar to what we have here domestically. And I think the important thing for healthcare providers who are working in this space is to recognize that these infrastructures, they're not just the walls that we're talking about, it's all the superstructures associated with it, whether it's policing domestically, border patrol, citizenship, the stigma that might come with, when someone says that I'm undocumented or someone says that I'm a felon, and the way it constrains what we call the geography or limits of care, where you can access healthcare resources, what resources you can access. Are you able to, do you have the constraints of being on Medi-Cal? Do you not have insurance because you're in a carceral facility? Are you ineligible for transplant because of your documentation status? So we really have to recognize the congruence of those things and bring in some of the lessons of abolition in the sense that this isn't kind of a practical next step, but what this is we have to have a vision of where we're trying to go to make sure that all of our proximate steps, whether it's in our asylum clinic that we work in, our emergency department, are all tied to the same direction. We're not just making random reactive moves to the suffering that we see, but it's part of a larger project to undo these structures. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about abolition it's abolishing the conditions under which prisons become the solution to the problem rather than abolishing the buildings we call prisons. And in this case, you can replace prisons with borders and you have the same idea and concept. And it's not only the abolition, it's also it's not just the absence, it's also the presence. So participating in the creation of structures that will make it so society doesn't need to have prisons, it doesn't need to have borders. And we'll go into a little bit more of that in a minute. So we're gonna talk about a couple of practical theories of action or change within these visions. And the two that we're gonna talk about are pragmatic and liberatory solidarity. I'm just gonna check how we're doing on time. So I'm gonna go with this slide first. So a lot of times people think about these things, and this is just a theory. I'm here to do things. I see folks who are in need and are in suffering every day. Like, what does this have to do with the action I wanna do? So this slide is trying to tie some of these things together, right? So on the left, the things in yellow relate to kind of prison abolition. On the right, we're talking about border abolition. And obviously we can't talk about everything here, but war on drugs, for instance, right? It's one of the main drivers of the prison industrial complex. It relates to medicine in the sense that it creates stigmatization of substance use and how we have historically treated folks. Similarly, if we're talking about borders and kind of economic imperialism, it's what promotes forced migration and health inequities in access to care. So that's structural competence. That's where this has to begin. When we educate about migration, when we talk about global health, we have to include this, because if we don't have the proper grounding. And then we talk about pragmatic solidarity. And this is, the Black Panthers back in the day would talk about survival programs. This is like, what do we do in this moment while we're working towards making the broader structural change? The example and the abolition example is the work that we're all doing now in emergency departments, or we're trying to do. We're talking about MAT, we're talking about harm reduction, we're talking about destigmatizing substance use as our piece of moving away from mass incarceration of folks who are dealing with addiction. Similarly, on the side of migration, there's survival programs, pragmatic solidarity in the sense of, some of the stuff we'll talk about today, language justice efforts, trauma-informed care, patient-centered advocacy, medical legal partnerships. There's things that we can practically do to better serve people in this moment, but they have to be, oops, I got super loud all of a sudden, sorry. It ties to this second part of imagining and creating new geographies of care. So what I mentioned earlier is that these infrastructures, they're not just the walls, they're infrastructures to extend to our healthcare practice, right? So we can't just operate within these constraints, we have to move beyond them. In the case of the war on drugs and addiction, there's a lot of things that folks probably participate in, right? So we're recognizing that we have to participate in street medicine efforts. We have to build out community systems of care. All the things that historically prisons have functioned in the place of in order to address this issue, and docs are a big part of that. Similarly, in the kind of the migration side of things, we have to engage in work like asylum efforts. It's not traditionally like a medical thing or something that we always learn about in emergency medicine. Medical legal partnerships. We have to move beyond. We have this dichotomy, and we see it in conferences as well. There's global health, and then there's like social emergency medicine, right? We have to talk about kind of transnational solidarity, working across borders with providers in different settings, non-medical providers, in order to kind of get out of these constraints that have historically been created. And then lastly, it's deconstructing this violent infrastructure. On the prison side and the jail side, it's decarceration efforts, the role of healthcare providers to say, we don't need mental health jails, we need community-based mental health, because this is what we're seeing in ERs. On the global health side, it's, demilitarization of borders, talking about things like patent law when it relates to like drugs and medications in other countries, and other things like climate change efforts. And the point of this is not that we have to do all these things or we have to know about all these things, but these should be integrated, right? We should be aware that this work is happening in different places, and we should be aligned. Otherwise, it just becomes reactive, kind of humanitarian stuff that may make us feel well and may make the individual in front of us feel better, but it's not addressing the underlying structural issue. So on this side, that's kind of the broad vision. This is a little bit more about how do we kind of carry ourselves in these spaces, because like I was saying, the infrastructures aren't just infrastructure, they also pervade how we kind of carry ourselves and do this work as doctors, as privileged individuals in society. So again, it starts with these conversations and the appropriate framework. It's kind of like a taboo thing to talk about abolition, in professional spaces, or it has been historically. So really being able to have the conversations that folks are having in communities and in other places. To do the work, and maybe not part of professional advancement or your position, or maybe unpaid, but that's a lot of times what's necessary to create those new geographies of care. It requires sacrifice, and sacrifice means different things in different places, but being willing to make those sacrifices. Doing the education, right? So global health has become a big part of medical school education, of emergency medicine training. Add on these layers into the conversations. Transitioning where we work, as I mentioned earlier, maybe there's a day laborer camp down the street from the hospital where you work, where people maybe feel stigmatized and don't want to come to the hospital. Engage with the organizing and community work that's happening there. And again, acknowledge our complicity. That's why I kind of pointed out the United Fruit Company down the street, right? A lot of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of displacement originates from not just the US, but places of power globally. And then, trauma-informed care in our interactions with patients on a day-to-day basis. So, with these principles in mind, we're going to talk a little bit about our kind of almost a case study in terms of some of the work that we've been doing, mostly Hannah, at the U.S.-Mexico border in Tijuana in particular. So again, when we're talking about an understanding of kind of the structural political background of why people are kind of in the predicament and suffering, in the situation they're in. Some of the policies, this is by no means kind of an extensive list or a comprehensive list, is a metering program that was initiated under the Obama administration, an appointment system that really kind of led to a backlog of folks at the border, which preceded the migrant protection protocols that folks may be more familiar with in 2019, which really, the Remain in Mexico policies, which forced a lot of folks to be stuck at the border and face new precarities and new dangers and violence in a place that isn't home. And then more recently, Title 42 in the setting of COVID, using public health as a justification to reinforce, some of these violent policies.
I just want to add really quickly that I think I've heard a lot from different people like that politics shouldn't be mixed with medicine, but the reality is that these policies affect the people that we serve. If you don't know what those are, then your patients will remind you. There have been a lot of patients I've had personally. I mean, they don't care if I'm controlling their diabetes. They care if I know anything about how to help their asylum case or if they should get a lawyer or questions like that, because actually that pertains more to their well-being in terms of their safety than me being able to give them metformin. And so I know it's hard to know all the policies that are affecting everyone. It's hard to keep up because it's not just these policies. There's a lot of other policies that affect our patients, lots of different other types of patients. But I think it's just really important to know. And then also to realize that it's not restricted to like one person like Donald Trump. Obama put the metering in for Haitian migrants, black migrants. That's how it was initially instituted. Metering didn't exist before Obama instituted it. And so I think it's good to recognize that these oppressive policies come from all sorts of politicians across the spectrum.
Yeah, thanks for that, Hannah. So, to bring it back, and part of the advocacy work is understanding kind of the health implications and making those clear. And these are a couple of papers that really did some work with folks at the border and demonstrated the behavioral health, the psychiatric trauma affected in folks who were affected by these policies, essentially, under the MPPs in the top paper and then Title 42 in the bottom paper here, how these policies not only created new trauma, but then it also exacerbated some of the social determinants of health, worsened health outcomes. So again, this is another mechanism of engaging with some of the structural changes, grounding the health practice with research work. We're going to kind of go through a couple of these statistics somewhat quickly, but this is essentially showing that the policy of late has been a combination of kind of sequestration of keeping people at the border or detainment, right? So this is the number of people who are detained in kind of border enforcement facilities. And you can see it's kind of almost exponentially increased over the last 20 to 30 years. And the interesting and unfortunate thing is if you put up again, to draw the analogies with the prison industrial complex, it was a similar thing that happened from the 70s into the 90s. And the important thing in both of these graphs or scenarios is that this isn't some natural progression of what's happening, right? These are state, federal policies that are created by individuals to respond to kind of precarity that folks are facing in the world or destabilization that's occurring for folks, or for whatever political agendas, and there are things that can be reversed. This chart essentially goes through kind of the asylum process and the number of folks who are granted asylum over time, and the most important thing, let's see if this works, is just the number of folks who are being denied. And you can see that the number of folks being denied asylum has also significantly and constantly increased over time. And again, this is driven by kind of political decisions of who's worthy, who's not worthy. And Hannah, I don't know if you want to mention kind of the more recent stuff with, or you're going to talk about it later, like Ukraine.
Oh yeah, I mean, so for those of you guys who are familiar with the whole Ukrainian situation, which is probably everyone who reads a newspaper at all, so for a long time we've been told in Tijuana that they can't possibly process any migrants. It was initially because they didn't have capacity. Then it was that Title 42, COVID's too dangerous, even though I was crossing every day across the border. And that went on for a long time and continues to go on. I mean, the border is still closed. But as you also might have read, there have been thousands of Ukrainian migrants who have flocked to Tijuana. I've been kind of part of some of the efforts to help the groups that are working with those migrants. And I can tell you that in a period of 2.5 weeks, 10,000 Ukrainian migrants were let across the border without any concern about COVID or processing or anything. And there's over 20,000 migrants in Tijuana right now who have been waiting over 2 years to have their asylum cases adjudicated. So, I mean, there's a lot of issues with that about who's worthy, right? Also, there is a big racial disparity there. So these are white migrants versus, everyone else we serve who are mostly brown and black migrants. And so, who they let across, and the policies really just enact a system to allow the people they want to cross, and to deny the people they don't want to cross, and that falls very much on racial lines.
And I'll kind of do this a little bit out of order because this gets to exactly that point. This is a study done by a nonprofit group working out of Tijuana as well, Al Otro Lado, which demonstrates the disparities, and particularly the disparities in access and financial costs related to bail bonds for Haitian migrants or folks from Haiti who are attempting to receive asylum. And a big part of this is also with the MPP policies that folks are staying in Mexico, they're less likely to receive representation. And that likely correlates with, the fact that less folks are granted asylum as well. So you can see the number of folks not represented almost, again, significantly increase over the last few years. And it just it's not just a racial thing, or it's not just a class-based thing, it's also kind of gendered violence with LGBTQIA plus migrants also disproportionately being affected by, these systems and infrastructure with prolonged periods of detainment as well as, sexual assaults and sexual abuse that are affected upon those folks. So that's kind of an understanding of the context and the policies, and we actually probably don't have like a ton of time, but so we talked about kind of survival programs. A critical part of survival programs is any of the work that we do. Language justice, we can't really do the work, we can't engage with folks if we can't truly understand their concerns, their stories, and a lot of times language and justice and being able to allow people to speak in their own terms and in their own languages is critical to that. And it's critical to us moving away from an assumption of what people need and what their priorities are, and kind of giving them medical care or giving them, even whatever, asylum, whatever else it may be, to really working in solidarity with folks. And there's like a handful of other things that I alluded to earlier that kind of fall into this category. So even working domestically, medical legal partnerships, having a network of legal resources that, you can refer folks to, doing advocacy work that is able to kind of interrogate and break down, or at least work around the barriers that folks who may be undocumented and migrants as well may face, are just some of the examples of how we, again, work in this survival mode in the setting of some of these structural challenges. Well, that'll hand it back over.
Yeah, and just to comment about language justice, which a lot of people that we work with in Los Angeles have done a lot of work on. I mean, it's so extremely important because people's stories, when you have a lot of trauma, it's difficult to tell your story in a way that's fluid. And so being able to be competent in the language or having a translator to help you understand things that are important to them is just so vital, especially with patients who have been extremely traumatized. So one of the things that I'm really grateful for having done this work is that part of like kind of transnational solidarity is I've worked with a lot of people I would have never worked with before and learned a lot, learned so much that I would have never learned before from midwives and psychologists and psychiatrists and other people. And I think it's been so helpful for me, actually, for my practice in the emergency department. And I think one of the things that I never really learned about at all in medicine until I started engaging in this work was, how do you really provide trauma-informed care, and what does that even mean? So, most asylum seekers have experienced trauma, so have a lot of our patients, especially if you work in communities that have traditionally been repressed or oppressed. It's just really important to remember that trauma has occurred in a lot of different moments of their lives. I think people see someone and they're like, oh, there was one traumatic event, but that's usually not true. In a lot of the asylum evals I've done, I know some of you guys who've done asylum evals, a lot of people have childhood trauma, and then they have trauma of whatever happened that caused them to flee their country. And then they have a lot of trauma during their journey: extortion, rape, imprisonment. They have trauma from them often being detained at the border and being sent back. They have trauma from when they're waiting at the border. A lot of people have been raped. Lots of gang rapes have happened in Tijuana, people whose children have been killed and their organs stolen, and just horrific stories. And then once they arrive in the United States too, there is a component of trauma that can happen just by trying to incorporate yourself into a new society and not always being completely welcomed, or even just trying to survive on a day-to-day basis as someone who doesn't have real documentation in the United States. So the impact of this is that not all families can heal from their trauma just because they have arrived in the United States and now obviously they're safe. And that this trauma that has happened, and you can see this in communities if you work in a community that has a long history of migration and immigration, that this trauma is multi-generational, that the trauma kind of moves down from parent to child. And if you've watched that Disney film, the recent Disney film, the one about, God, I'm forgetting the name. Encanto, yeah, Encanto is a great demonstration of intergenerational trauma if you want Cliff Notes and to watch a Disney movie. I don't like animated films, but I liked that for that reason. One thing to just remember in the ER, and I know it kind of annoys us to see patients who aren't there for like a STEMI or to be intubated, but a lot of our patients do come in with like manifestations of trauma, and they're really varied. You can see them. People can be irritable, have just pain all over, be sad or shaky, have low energy, because traumatic memories are stored somatically. And it becomes almost impossible to like cognitively push through that if you are deeply traumatized. Like, you need treatment for that to be able to push through that. So just telling them to like feel better or that it's just anxiety is not really gonna work super well for helping someone feel better. So you're gonna see like panic attacks or feelings of isolation, and et cetera. Obviously, the treatment of PTSD is multifaceted and varies based on cultural and other experiences that someone might have, but if there's a way that you have to connect people who you can identify to the proper services, that can be extremely helpful to them. So what is like trauma-informed care? I mean, obviously I don't have time. This isn't a lecture on trauma-informed care, but I think it really rests on creating an anti-oppressive practice that you're participating in. It's not enough to just like band-aid the symptoms like we do in the ER. You really have to do your own excavation of your own power and privilege. Otherwise, you have the capacity to do more harm than good for your patients. And so, I like this wheel of power and privilege because, we all have either been born into, and some of us have earned, but we all have different levels of power and privilege and different categories that are put here. And it's really important to go through and understand the ways in which you are privileged, whether you've earned that or you were just born into that, and how that might affect the patients that you interact with on a patient-to-patient level. So this wheel, I think I like this one too because it kind of takes the last one, where you're kind of just thinking about your own power and privilege and understanding that oppression is often the broader context in which trauma happens. So you can kind of see this here about understanding your own unique circumstances of power, privilege, and identity, and how that affects all these other things that we talk about and hear about all the times, with the kind of individual being in the center, but all these larger systemic structural forces being on the outside. And I was talking to someone about this yesterday who knows a lot about this, and, she was like, this isn't just for your patients. This is for your colleagues, it's for you, and it's for wherever you go in practice and whatever organization you're part of. This is super important to engage with, because this is how we are gonna be able to really create solidarity and create change. on like a more individual basis, spreading outward. So this is just kind of a summary of those sort of lessons. So, you have to have a commitment to being conscientious of the power and privilege of a practitioner and how that might impact the person or perception of that person might have of you. You need to acknowledge the impacts of like sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism on each patient and how you might be participating in those processes of oppression. You have to empower, our patients who are really consumers to explore and grieve historical and generational trauma that might be affecting them. Like, don't gaslight them, which is something I think I've been more aware that I do in my day-to-day practice is I like subtly gaslight patients, and I've tried to be more aware of like how to not do that about the things that people are experiencing. And we have to explore treatment options that are culturally specific to people. Their community and their values, and that really applies for like asylum seekers and refugees. So these are just some practical sort of things, and these apply, some things we can't change in our own emergency departments, although I wish I could. I wish we could have like why do hospitals look like they do? They don't look safe. There's like police, and they're white and sterile and not comforting at all in most places, and so that's really a huge problem in a conversation that I wish I'd have, but the reality is that most of us, that's not gonna change right away, so most of us have to work in places that aren't exactly warm and inviting. But we can create small changes in our emergency departments if we ask and advocate for them from administrators. That can be really helpful. So well-lit, warm, inviting, our privacy is a big one in the ER. Collaboration, so like work in places that are integrated. Like I said, I've learned so much from working in a more integrated setting than I did before. ERs are not really well integrated, so how can we make that happen? Being really transparent and having, talking with your patients about informed consent and being trustworthy, so staying within your capacity with support. When I have clients or patients in Tijuana that start kind of going into a spiral and going down a pathway of talking to me about all the traumatic events they have experienced, as much as those things can sometimes be kind of interesting or intriguing to me as a person to hear these really horrific stories, I try to stop people because I am not trained to deal with the consequence of them of the re-traumatization process. And so learning to be like, I really want to hear, I'm really so sorry this happened to you. Let me try to find you a professional who can help walk you through this is really important. Peer support, so yeah, just being properly supervised and providing your own self-care, and then involving patients in the treatment process, which I think is hugely important for us in the ER setting. We don't have a lot of really great prepared materials for patients about how to deal with traumatic symptoms. I wish we had more, in discharge instructions. One of the things that we've done in Tijuana that I hope to involve in some of the practice I do in the United States is that the psychologists and psychiatrists I work with have made audio, little podcasts to help people work through stuff or meditate, and I think that would be awesome if there's a way we could QR code those into people's phones in the ER. So trying to do things like that for people when they come and visit, because some of those things might be the most important thing you do for a patient on that visit, especially if you've ruled out almost everything else that could be organic. So that's kind of the end of our presentation, leaving us maybe 5 minutes for questions. I don't know if anyone has any.
start. I definitely won't be able to kind of capture the extent of your question, but just to repeat it briefly, alluding to kind of reimagining geographies of care and deconstructing violent infrastructure, kind of what conversations or opportunities for us to engage is given kind of our positionality. I think it's a great question. I think it's like the most challenging one of it all. I think it's one of these key areas where we have to look maybe beyond, definitely maybe emergency medicine and beyond. I know like in the medicine world, there's groups like the People's Health Movement who have connected the dots between health to some of these like trade policies, like, you know, the classic one, the infamous one is NAFTA, the modern iterations of it, like patent laws that exist, structural adjustment programs and the modern iterations where, you know, in order for a country to get aid from us, you have to essentially dismantle your health system and your whatever other social services in your country. So there's groups like that that are starting to make those connections. So I think that's like a starting point. I think domestically kind of making, for me, it's been useful. I do some work related to the carceral system and reentry. People, again, you know, there's organizing efforts going on about jails and there's organizing efforts going on about migrants, but, you know, opportunities to bring those conversations together and build power there makes a lot of sense as well. But I think it's definitely something no easy answer for.
Yeah, I think we both of us have struggled to figure out how exactly to do that. I think that's really the question, like how do we elevate our privilege and use that to actually bring some of these structures down. I mean, I do think it's really important just to talk about it. Like, no one talks about how capitalism is really creating all of this, and we all benefit from capitalism. And that word is like kind of taboo, you know, and saying that in like these sort of more academic-y settings. So I think that's part of it, is starting to have the conversation. I think, yeah, we have really tried to like work with local organizations that are already doing some of this work and have a lot of history like in communities doing various sorts of abolition work and working across sectors with one another, and how can we support them? Like, how can we use our privilege to advance their movements? I think has, for me, been the most important question. And then for the work that I do, like, internationally, I guess you would say, it doesn't always feel international when you're in Tijuana right at the border, but I think a lot of it is trying to figure out, like, how do you truly have transnational solidarity? Like, what does that mean? Physically, and how do you not just like band-aid things and be part of the problem? Like every day when we go and do our work in Tijuana, that we, you know, it's an organization that I started with a bunch of people from Mexico and the United States, but still like a lot of that is band-aid. You know, it's band-aid, and a lot of the asylum evaluations and medical legal stuff I do, it actually has to validate the system. Like, they're important for individuals, and I still do them because I think it's good to alleviate suffering and to try to create solutions in the meantime. But like, how do you work with those organizations to truly be radical and try to break those organizations down? And I think some of that work is happening amongst like legal groups and humanitarian groups and all these things, like trying to use tricks to try to break down the underlying principles that are upholding a lot of these structures. Like, how do you be covert? But I don't think that there isn't. And there are movements in the United States that are aimed at abolition of borders, and, you know, as providers, I think we should join them, you know. But the question is, like, how do you truly do that in a more organized fashion? Like, is there a way for us to do that? I mean, I love that question, and anyone who wants to organize along those lines, yeah, let's get together and do it. All right, thank you guys so much. Happy to talk to you guys after the end of the session if anyone has any questions.
That's so good.